author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As you think, so you become. Our busy minds are forever jumping to conclusions, manufacturing and interpreting signs that aren't there. So noted the Greek philosopher Epictetus. And it seems this particular epitaph applies all too well to the burgeoning 2024 political race. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On this week's show, the 2024 top-tier candidates list is far from settled, and there could be dark horses gaining place on the pack leaders. The economy once again faces the reality of Bidenomics, and does X mark the spot for a free speech revival? We'll be discussing all this and a whole lot more on today's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. All eyes are on a rematch between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. But is there a non-candidate candidate that Republicans have been overlooking? Well, we're joined today by longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, to examine just that question. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Nice to be here, Mark.
So, Tim, most people reckon on a Trump-Biden rematch. That's the received wisdom at the moment, assuming Donald Trump isn't behind bars. And even then, I'd say that with the magic of technology.
There's still no guarantee he won't be the nominee.
Absolutely.
Or even the president.
Very true. And Ron DeSantis, basically the second in line, according to the polls for the Republican nomination, he seems to have scuppered his own campaign. Which could still recover, but at present it's looking a bit shaky. Now, you think, according to an article you wrote on the page of LibertyNation.com, which is well worth a read, that somebody else might enter the race, given the correct circumstances?
Well, that's a big if, though, because the man we're talking about is someone who, if you started from scratch and you said Trump is out of the picture, he retired, wasn't running, and you ask people today, who would you select from the remainder of Republican candidates and potential candidates? I think at this point, more and more the answer would be the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. Now, Youngkin is amiable. He's relatable. He is yet very firm in his convictions. He has turned Virginia from dangerously blue for Republicans to, a pretty deep shade of purple. He's flipped the state house there and hopes to flip the state Senate. And here's the most interesting thing about Youngkin. Now, it's just one state because he's not a declared candidate, so there's not a lot of polling on how he would run against other Republicans and against Biden. But in Virginia, in a poll done by Virginia Commonwealth University, Trump, unsurprisingly, would lose to Biden in Virginia, as he has lost Virginia the last two elections, and they weren't close. Trump is not popular at all in Virginia. But if Youngkin was the candidate, he would beat Biden by 14 points. Now, that is to some degree a referendum on his governorship, but that's fine too. But this is one state which, until pretty recently, was considered a swing state, that Youngkin, I think, clearly would carry. He is someone who is so acceptable to so many people across the Republican conservative landscape that I think everybody agrees he'd be a winner. And, well, that's what a mega donor who was quoted on Fox News said, that he could beat Trump, he could beat anybody. At the same time, Glenn Youngkin can say to himself, why should I run now against the 100-pound gorilla that is Trump, who takes all the oxygen out of the room when I could just wait 4 years? And have a clear field whether Trump wins or not, he's out in 2028 for sure. So why should he sully himself and go head to head with Trump, who's certain to low bridge him, right?
Yeah.
And
I mean, that 14% margin, that's just insane. I mean, that's well
that's
outside
notable.
of the margin
Yes.
of error.
Yes.
And for Virginia, I mean, that's got to be causing consternation back
Well, let's
in
put it this way.
the
In
White House.
Virginia is the only state in the country that permits a governor to serve only one consecutive term, right? In other words, one term. Now, Terry McAuliffe was governor, then he was out, and he tried to come back. Youngkin beat him, and he ran a flawless race. Mark, I tell you, I've been watching politics for 60 years, and I've never seen, especially a rookie candidate like Glenn Youngkin, run a flawless campaign. He literally made zero mistakes. And so it's his competence as a politician, too, that is extremely attractive. And let's face it, at this point, everybody's asking, what if with Trump? He's got 3 indictments, another one likely coming from Georgia. And the possibility of it being prosecuted or even being behind bars is real enough for Republicans to now strongly consider who they would want as a replacement. And Ron DeSantis so far hasn't cut it, just fired his campaign manager, reassigned him, I should say. But his campaign has done nothing but drop since he was basically tied with Trump 5 months ago.
Yeah. I mean, it seems odd that there really has been so little speculation about Youngkin's possible attempt at the White House, especially considering, as you say, the performance he gave to win back Virginia that's been trending so blue in recent years. Do you think it's maybe there's a bit of the Harry Potter syndrome going on in the legacy media? It's like, don't speak his name because it'll only make him more powerful. Do you think that's what's happening? Why nobody's talking about what a threat he could be?
Well, because here's the thing. He is such a deft politician that he's sent out clear signals to Donald Trump that anything that would appear to be a campaign appearance is merely for him to use as a platform to showcase himself as a potential vice president. In other words, he's saying, don't worry, Donald, I'm not running against you, but I will make myself available as a potential running mate. And all of this is evidenced by a big fundraiser he had in the Hamptons, the Shishi resort that the rich and famous summer in. And, the returns were very good, but he is being showcased in a sort of alternative universe where Trump either can't run or is no longer palatable. And I think he would finish ahead, certainly, of almost anyone in that current Republican field, including DeSantis for sure, the way things are going for him now. Though, as you say, they could turn around.
So it's almost like on the political right, you've got this dark horse, Glenn Youngkin, who has a lot going for him and could be very successful nationwide. On the left, you've also got Gavin Newsom, who has also said to his commander-in-chief, his party leader, Joe Biden, that he's not going to run against him. And so you've got these two very capable politicians. Just in the last 30 seconds, Tim, can you see any possibility of a Youngkin-Newsom attack for 2024?
Well, I will say this much. Any doubts that Newsom in particular, but also Youngkin, any doubts that they have presidential aspirations have essentially been eliminated. And I think both of them are basically looking to 2028 because 2024 seems locked in as much as a majority of the public doesn't want to see either Biden or Trump running again.
Yeah, it's a funny world when we're more confident about who's going to be running in 2028 than just next year in
That's
2024.
true.
We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break discussing the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune besetting the 45th president and what that means for the upcoming debates. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. We're joined once again by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier on, we talked about the dark horse candidacy of Governor Glenn Youngkin, but now I want to switch to the hopes and dreams of former President Trump and his quest to become president once more. And more specifically, what's going to happen in those all-important debates. Now, Tim, Trump's in a bit of a sticky wicket, isn't he? He's indictment after indictment, and at the time of recording, another charge likely coming down from Georgia. That hasn't arrived yet, but we are expecting it. Now, how does he weather this storm politically and continue campaigning?
Well, I think he's going to have to concede the fact, or maybe magnify the fact that he's going to be spending most of his time at the most, or much of his time at the least, responding to these indictments between hearings, arraignments, and actual trials, and petitions filed by his lawyer to try and keep delaying things.
It's sorry to interrupt him. It's a shame for him that none of the trials are in New Hampshire, Iowa, all of the early states.
Yeah, that's true. He would take sure. Or how about Virginia? You know, so we could say Youngkin can't do any better than me in Virginia. But here's the thing, though. He has to weigh, and let's make a point here as evidenced by the Trump TV ads that have been released so far, that he has a very sharp and competent campaign staff this time around. He's much more organized than he was in 2020 because everybody was responding to the pandemic. So he has to decide how to turn his constant stream of legal entanglements between now and Election Day 2024 into somehow a virtue to make himself a victim among victims, for it to project that the other side will do anything to take him down, as no less than someone like Doris Kearns Goodwin, the famed left-wing historian, said this week, look, I'm paraphrasing her here, but look, it's necessary to do what's necessary, whatever it takes, to make sure Trump does not ascend to the White House again. I mean, that's just saying out loud what everybody already knows they're committed to doing. But
it's like the communist refrain, isn't it, of by any means necessary?
But it's a Stalinist, it's Stalinist justice, where it says, show me the man, I'll show you the crime. Not once or twice, or probably even 3 times, but 4 times. I mean, they want to really make sure that they seal the deal. But, that begs the question of how exactly he can talk about anything except the fact of his indictments, because you can't think that people, whether they're inclined to vote for him or not, are going to want to hear nothing but legal depositions over the next 15 months before the election. So, I mean, to say, Mark, that we're in uncharted territory with a major party nominee under multiple indictments would, I think, be the understatement of the year, if not all of American political history.
Almost certainly. It's interesting you say that about how the voting public probably don't want to hear about the indictments and the legal defense strategies, and I think that's a good reason why Trump doesn't appear to be willing to go into the GOP primary debates at the moment. And of course, when you're in the lead by so much, there's not always a need to. But one thing that will come up is, if he is the eventual nominee, and if Joe Biden is still in the running by then, he'll have to get on a debate stage with Joe Biden. Now, I know that historically several presidents have just not engaged in this, and that might be the case, but it would certainly be a bad look for Joe Biden not to engage in that. And so I think one of the important questions that needs looking at is what happens if they both take to the debate stage. Last time, the media called it for Biden, naturally, because that's what the majority of the legacy media does. But he had all of these good things going for him then. Joe Biden had all of these good things going for him then. But those don't exist anymore, do they?
Well, he had good things by virtue simply of being not named Trump. That was it, right? He was the alternative that could be a return to normalcy, so to speak. He could be the moderate Democrat that he's always claimed to be, even though he hasn't been, especially lately. But now you've got a reality, you've got a record, and you've got some of the ammunition, a lot that he used in 2020 to defend himself against the Hunter Biden affair. And, you know, the way his Justice Department has unleashed its fury on Donald Trump. I mean, he's a very different guy now, not to mention that 4 years of cognitive decline. Look, it's 15 months till the election, and that's a lifetime for someone who is in arguably, you know, a state of fairly rapid decline. I mean, I think we can see the difference now, even from when he was first running for office. But look, Trump has a couple of issues here. Yes, he's 40, 50, whatever it is, points ahead. Someone who's that far ahead rarely agrees to a debate. So from a standpoint of political strategy, it would make sense for Trump to just pass on the idea of this Fox debate on August 23rd. But consider the Trump ego and consider the 45th president sitting in his living room watching Ron DeSantis front and center in a Republican debate. Couldn't that pretty much, it could sink DeSantis, but it could really elevate him as the leading choice if it's not Trump, which, of course, if it's not Trump, appears as a live possibility because of all the indictments, right? So I'm not sure that Trump's ego could handle seeing DeSantis as essentially the front runner in a large debate in that center position on the stage. So that's the conundrum that he faces in as far as going against Biden. Look, if Biden doesn't debate, refuses to debate, then there's no question that it's nothing less than an admission that he isn't up to it. And this is from a man whose, let's say, whose mental state is very much in question as the oldest American president in history. So I think Trump has a lot of choices to make, both for the primary and for the general election when it comes to debates.
Wise words indeed. Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Two of the three major credit rating agencies have downgraded the U.S. economy. But according to the White House, what used to matter doesn't matter anymore. So what's happening, and how is the Biden administration spinning that which cannot be spun? We're very lucky to be joined by Liberty Nation's economics editor, host of the superb Swamponomics videocast, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for coming in, Andrew.
Mike, I'll tell you something. It doesn't, just because we got a downgrade, it doesn't mean we have a downgrade.
That's some wise words from President Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, just there. Now, let's get back to actual Andrew. Now, let's start with the prognosis, Andrew. What are the ratings agencies saying? I believe it's just Moody's and Fitch at the moment. Has Standard & Poor's said anything?
No, they were the first one to issue the downgrade back in 2011. Okay. And then the guy who issued the downgrade, he said, "Hey, see, I've been proven wrong. I've been proven correct. I've been vindicated." So so S&P, perhaps they'll do another one. Who knows?
Okay, so what does it mean then that the U.S. credit has been downgraded?
So pretty much, it just means that U.S. Treasury securities are long-term foreign currency issuing, which is the technical term for it. Just means that its rating has been downgraded by a notch. It went from AAA to AA plus. As you mentioned, our Standard & Poor's, they're the ones who in 2011 did the same thing to the U.S. government debt. So those are two agencies, and then recently Moody's, they downgraded the banks. So you have a double whammy of U.S. government and then the big banks, or the banking sector, I should say. Excuse me.
So, cause I'm a bit of an economics idiot, but a downgrading means that on the world stage, the strength of the various sectors, so here the US government and the banking sector, these outside agencies are saying they're not as good as they used to be. That's what a downgrading means, or they don't have as much confidence in the ability of them performing their functions as they used to. Is that about right?
Yes. I think that's a great summary of it. So let's look at what they said. So Fitch said when it comes to the U.S. government that its fiscal deterioration is problematic. Its general government debt burdens are escalating. Governance is an issue. And then you look at a Moody's downgrade, they're worried also about how these small and mid-sized banks can handle a rising rate environment. There's too much debt, and then you have too much exposure to the commercial real estate market. So those are the issues that are affecting both the government and the banks.
And how does such a downgrade affect the economy? How does that affect American citizens, just regular folks?
Yeah, so I wrote that in Liberty Nation. When it comes to the government downgrade, it's not going to really impact people very much. I mean, the reason why people are not panicking as much while the financial markets didn't continue its sell off was because it's not going to really matter. The U.S. Treasury market is highly
the sell off's happening. It's just not getting any worse, right?
well. The sell-off happened. Well, the sell-off happened for a couple of reasons. I mean, do you want to go into the stock market and what?
Let's go back to the original one.
Okay. Yeah. So the reason why it doesn't matter much is because the U.S. Treasury market is highly liquid. There's growing demand all over the world for it. That's why Treasury Secretary, she was upset, but she tried assuring everyone that it doesn't really matter because everyone's scooping up treasuries. Why do you think the U.S. Treasury Department issued $1 trillion in the third quarter? Or why they're issuing another $800 billion in the fourth quarter? So people buy into it. People believe in the U.S. government and they believe in the U.S. bonds.
Just not quite as much as they did a couple of weeks ago. So the White House tried to blame all this on Donald Trump, as you coined the phrase. It's the Trump downgrade. Just to reiterate what the White House has been saying, But you mentioned one of the things that I think it was Fitch has said, that they were concerned about governance. Now, Donald Trump's no longer president. So the governance they're talking about is not from 2016 to 2020 or beginning of 2021. It's the governance that's taking place now, right?
Yeah, so if you look at the Fitch report and also what its CEO said in interviews, that the Democrats have gone too far left and the Republicans have gone too far right, and there's no middle ground anymore. So that makes it harder to come up with these debt ceiling agreements, come up with more fiscal responsible measures. Those are the issues that the analysts have been looking at.
Okay, so how fair is it of the Biden administration to call this the Trump downgrade?
It's absurd to blame President Trump. He hasn't been in office in 3 years now. I mean, yes, I completely agree that he added to the fiscal mess too, but even before the pandemic by running these growing the deficits and adding to the national debt. But to blame it on Trump is absurd because the Biden administration, if you look at the 12-month rolling deficit as just an example, it's north of already $2 trillion. That Fiscal Responsibility Act or the debt ceiling agreement, that's going to add about $5 trillion to national debt by the time that the agreement is up in January 2025. So it's mind-numbing to me how you can blame a guy who has been in office for a while as opposed to just taking responsibility and saying, yeah, okay, we spent too much. But of course, no one will ever admit to that we spent too much when you're holding office.
Well, you've got to keep spending. You've got to do whatever it takes to achieve whatever goal it happens to be. Now, it seems to me, and I might be wrong here, because as mentioned on pretty much every occasion we talk, I'm not an economist and I don't really understand everything that's taking place. But it seems to me that this is the start of something rather than the end of something. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I feel that there's going to be another downgrade, but I suspect it means there are stormy financial times ahead. What's your take?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. But you look at all the numbers in both the public sector and the private sector. You have, we talked offline briefly about the credit card debt hitting $1 trillion. You have annual interest payments that are $1 trillion. You have the running deficit of $2.2 trillion. You have another $1.6 trillion fiscal deficit for the current fiscal year. You have $33 trillion national debt. All these numbers are just, and why it's being exacerbated is because of the higher interest rates. Why are interest rates higher? Because of all the inflation that occurred heading into that occurred from the pandemic and post-pandemic economy. So all these factors are just amassing, and it's going to lead to such horrific financial times ahead. Because I mean, no matter how much the administration spins how great Bidenomics is, you look at all the numbers underneath.
I detect a note of sarcasm there. Sorry, Andrew. No matter how great Bidenomics is.
Well, that's what they say. I mean, that's what Vice President Kamala Harris, she cackles and says, "Oh, Bidenomics is working. Bidenomics is working," but it's not. I monitor this data all the time. Manufacturing is in a recession. Consumption levels are easing. Pandemic era savings from low and middle income households have been completely exhausted. So, I mean, really, the thing that's propping up this economy, what it seems anyway, is government spending, because all this CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, well, bipartisan, I don't know if you can call that bipartisan, but anyway, all that money is just funneling, are subsidizing many sectors of the economy, from manufacturing to this whole green energy push, healthcare, social assistance. And I've written previously, I talked about in my Swamponomics TV, is that the government has been one of the biggest job creators this year, adding about 380,000 jobs since January.
Isn't that a bit of a dangerous situation, though, for the government to be the number one job creator? Is essentially creating a giant behemoth that you have to keep funding it, otherwise real people lose their jobs, not just the DC swamp dwellers, but actual people lose their jobs. I'm reminded of the British National Health Service, where somebody quipped a few decades ago that the NHS was in danger of becoming a health service with a government attached to it. And I think we're approaching that now, as 50% of government spending is NHS related. Isn't the US in danger of becoming that particular beast? An employer with a country attached?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, let's use the green energy push as an example of this. A lot of these factories that are being constructed all over the United States, a lot of it is billions of dollars of it is subsidized by the federal and state governments, and which results in taxpayers having to spend millions of dollars per green energy job. What happens when the government shuts off the tap, or if the government ever shuts off the tap? Will these plants just shut down? Will they relocate? Are they going to fire workers? So you do have unintended consequences of that.
But that's a question for the politicians who are trying to get elected in that cycle. Andrew Moran, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Elon Musk makes an offer that the suspended, the derailed, and the fired may not be able to refuse, and the Backpage scandal makes a comeback. And welcome back to yourselves to Liberty Nation Radio. We're talking liberty with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the Awesome Uprising podcast, and a Spartan warrior for free speech, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate all that.
A Spartan without the red cape and no pants, of course. He is a modern day Spartan. So
there's a reason why we're shooting me from the sternum up.
Absolutely. Now let's start with the Backpage story, Scott. Now I remember this from years ago. Why is it still going on?
Well, it's still going on because for some reason the government can't get the prosecution of the Backpage founders out of its blood, in spite of the evidence and in spite of their own findings. We most recently have a delay now in a trial that was previously delayed because of a mistrial, because of government malfeasance.
Yeah.
The prosecutors in the case illegally and inappropriately tried to link the charges to child sex trafficking, which they never were and had never anything to do with. But of course, that's what raises the ire and scorn of people who are observing, the trial and the charges, and so
specifically the jurors, which would
certainly
be the
yes,
one.
and so there was a mistrial declared years ago when it was first brought to trial. And then most recently, one of the two founders, James Larkins, committed suicide on the eve of trial. It was supposed to go to trial a few days ago, and because of his suicide, has been delayed until late in August. So, Mr. Michael Lacey is the name of the second person who's on trial, and he will now bear the brunt of the government's prosecution in this case.
I would hate to speculate on why somebody would choose to take their own life, but it's certainly notable that they've been fighting this for many years, and it's on the eve of the new trial that it happens.
It could be a decade, Mark, that they've been fighting various charges, perhaps not these specific ones. These are federal criminal charges. They've faced state criminal charges in the past and had them tossed out. They've never been convicted of any crime, but yet the government seems to keep coming after them again and again. And of course, like I said, so violated their right to a free trial, or a fair trial rather, that the federal judge said we have to stop this trial in its tracks because they keep going over the line and trying to attribute criminality and a heinous criminality for child sex trafficking to the defendants, who, and there's no evidence to suggest that they did that, and they haven't been charged with that. It's a feature, Mark, I find I observe throughout prosecutorial and political appointees' discussion of charges in the area of sex crimes, because they are, it's such a hero's cape to wear, right? To protect the vulnerable, to protect the children. So if you say, we're going to put some 50-year-old lady in a cage who'd rather sell her body than bust tables at a Denny's, that doesn't play as well with the political people who put them in office than saying, here's this victimized teenager who we're protecting from these ogres who would, exploit her. And so that's the narrative they run with, even if it's not true, like in the case of Mr. Lacey and Larkin. And one does wonder, did it contribute to his suicide, of course?
I believe that there's a Kamala Harris involvement in this initial prosecution, isn't there?
Well, Kamala Harris prosecuted both of the men for pimping or pandering, promoting prostitution criminally under state law in California, and those charges were thrown out. And as an attack on the First Amendment. Now, these people established a website that was a competitor to Craigslist in the early 2000s. That's how they got their start. And it was fueled by the success of those classified ads and commercial sex advertising. Now, when I say commercial sex advertising, I use those terms advisedly, Mark, because prostitution is something that is a component of commercial sex advertising, but not all commercial sex advertising is prostitution or is forbidden by law. And Mr. Lacey and Larkin, well, now it's just Mr. Lacey, I guess, who is the active criminal defendant, has always maintained that they never took ads on purpose that promoted prostitution. They were aware they were taking ads, of course, that were commercial sex, industry ads, but not the actual prohibited acts of prostitution. And a close examination of those ads reveals that oftentimes they aren't about prostitution. And there's a huge universe of permissible, legal, commercial sexual activity that falls short of prostitution that one is allowed to make money off of advertising. And that's what they did.
Yeah, it seems strange that 10 years worth of government effort would go against this when there has been so many setbacks to the government's case. And then you look at, for example, I'm not saying that the government's playing favorites or that prosecution is political, which of course every prosecution is, but you look at the amount of child sexual exploitation that takes place on platforms like Facebook and the other social media platforms, and even the more centralized ones. And yet we don't hear about a 10-year crusade against people who may be making money from those platforms.
The facts seem to suggest it's remarkably political. Mr. Larkin started this alternative chain of newspapers. That's how he got his start. Lacey and Larkin. Larkin was the publisher and Lacey was the editor. That's sort of how the team got started. And then they started to make a ton of money off of these classified ads. But they were fueling journalistic enterprises. To be clear, this wasn't a group of people that were just interested in profiting off of near prostitution, commercial sex trafficking, or something, along those lines. They did hard-hitting independent journalism. And one of their targets was John McCain, by the way. They're Arizona-based, and they started locally. For instance, Joe Arpaio, they were responsible for Sheriff Joe, America's sheriff. They were responsible for many of the revelations of his disgraceful conduct, feathering his own nest, and violations of civil rights of those who were his political enemies. And the same for John McCain. And also the funny business with McCain's wife and her drug sort of conviction that, she was allowed to basically plead to a slap on the wrist for stealing drugs in a way that defendants who were not highly connected would not have been. And they reported on these things and exposed them. And they allege that these political figures wanted them prosecuted. And here's what we know, Mark. The lawyers who aren't politicians at the Department of Justice wrote a memo that said, don't prosecute these guys. They said they're actually helping the cause for child sex trafficking victims. And the reason why is because they were remarkably responsive to requests for investigative help by the FBI. They had like a button that said report this listing for somebody who maybe appear underage. And they had their own internal policies. This is the DOJ saying this, Mark. The DOJ said that they erred on the side of caution with displaying ads that may have featured underage individuals, for instance.
Well, we will keep following this when it eventually does get to trial, assuming anybody's left by the time it does. And we'll see what the Department of Justice has to say about it this time around. Now, Scott, very quickly, I'd just like to broach one more topic with you, and that's Elon Musk offering to pay the legal fees of anybody who's lost their job or been downgraded because of liking or their activities on Twitter. What is he on about? He can't be entirely serious, can he?
If you were unfairly treated by your employer due to posting or liking something on this platform, we will fund your legal bill. No limit. Please let us know. That is the text of the tweet.
That is a bold
Mark.
statement.
It's almost like I'm surprised it hasn't been deleted by now, because certainly the requests are going to come in a deluge. And just for anybody who's reading it, in the first week of law school and contracts class, you'll learn that the establishment of a contract depends on the meeting of the minds, which is to say that both people have agreed for a thing. And this does not include a meeting of the minds. If you were fired, Elon Musk doesn't have the legal obligation now to pay your bills. But I think it's a great shot across the bow for some larger employers. He has shown a willingness to kind of put his money where his mouth is with free speech with the platform. And he has hired some remarkable, free speech stalwart lawyers. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Get your popcorn ready.
And wait for Donald Trump to claim his legal fees from Elon Musk. Scott DeCosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast across the Radio America network. I'd like to thank our guests for today, Mr. Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, and Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. And of course, my thanks to you, the listeners, for taking the time to join us here on the show. We'll be back next week with a special edition. Make sure to tune in. Thanks a lot. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.